I think it was 70 a week and a half ago.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, oh yeah, big shifts. Okay, here we are. Live. Excellent. Um, Hello, those of you joining us on Facebook Live. We are here for our regular Tuesday New Jerusalem discussion group. And we're making some progress. I realize in my book we're about halfway through. And this week our chapter is concerning conscience, the role of our conscience in the spiritual life. And as always, we're seeking to reflect on these topics as they relate to our own individual experience of ourselves and of God, and then also what this role of conscience has to do with how we form community, how we form church with others, and foster the spiritual life. So I'm excited. I'm pleased to be joined this morning by Robbin Ferriman. If you want to say hi, Robbin.
Hi, everybody.
Oh, and it looks like Paul was able to join us too.
Oh,
excellent.
good.
I was hoping we'd have a third today, so
Oh,
him in as well. Paul Demming from St. Louis. Paul, so glad you could join us today. I want to say hello to everybody.
Hello, everyone.
There we
Good
go.
to be.
Wonderful. So glad you could be here. So our topic is conscience, and I'm excited to dig into this one. I admit that, and maybe I'll just start with something that's sort of sitting with me. Right. So the very first sentence of this chapter is, a conscience forms in us on the basis of whatever religious tradition we follow, depending on how deeply we internalize that tradition. And I've been sitting with that as a human who grew up without a religious tradition as a child. I didn't have, I was baptized at a Methodist church because of my grandmother's prompting. I asked my mother shares the story that I once asked her if the Burger King was God. I was curious about religion. I certainly feel I was raised with love, deep love. And I do believe, and I've been thinking about stories of myself as a child, that I certainly developed a conscience before coming into religious community. But I've been sitting with that and kind of what Swedenborg, certainly he was living in a time where religion was the water people swam in, communities were Christian, or religion was much more, it was like you had a neighborhood and you had a church. It wasn't something that we had to choose, but in our time, it's very much that way. And anyway, I wondered if you two had any thoughts about that, or if you had similar experiences in your upbringing, and how you think about the formation of our conscience, that as children and young adults, kind of what the ground is, because it does seem clear in here that the ground of conscience is what we are taught, kind of what we come to understand about the good life. And anyway,
I think that was an interesting section too, to say that, because everybody, we are all brought up with different faith traditions, if any. Mm-hmm. And in my family, it was a really mixed bag as well, because my family wasn't hardcore religious. My dad didn't go to church except for holidays when mom made him. And my mother was always searching also. So we did a lot of church hopping. So there was no fixed ideas about anything for us, except for my grandmother on my father's side. She was in the Salvation Army, and she was real hardcore. And it was kind of like a missionary Baptist style church. And she had her ideas. And my mother would scoff at her ideas because she didn't believe that. So then I got this negative. So it was like, you can believe this, but you can't believe that, even though she believes this. And it was just a mixed bag. And so, yeah, when I think about conscience based on what we were taught, it's really confusing and really vague and kind of sketchy for me as far as that goes. Mm-hmm. I was loved and taught the basics right and wrong as a child, don't cross the street when there's traffic and be nice to your sisters kind of thing, but I felt that spiritually wise, I was kind of on my own trying to figure that out. That's how I
Mhm.
felt growing up, trying to figure all
Probably
this
had.
out. I heard a lot of stuff from my grandmother, who had really strict beliefs about religion, where my mother was much more lenient and flexible.
Mhm.
Um, so
Sounds
yeah,
like we had a similar experience, and maybe a lot of people in the world today have had those similar
yeah,
experiences. And I really resonate with like being aware as a child of conflicting ideas. I feel like I was very aware too of my parents having opinions and opinions about other people, and really exposed to
yes.
a lot of that as a child. Whereas I wonder if in previous times that may have been less of the case. There may have been more of a sense of there is one clear articulation of the good life or the way to be. It's funny, I was having memories of even, I think part of some of the stuff, some of what I picked up was kind of strict. I remember hearing my parents listening to a John Mellencamp song when I was young, and it had I think it was the word damn. I don't even think it was, and being kind of, oh my goodness, kind of taken aback. I was probably 6 or 7, so there was a part of me that kind of was concerned about being good, and was concerned about doing what is right, and a lot of question about what that was, what the good or the what that was. What about you, Paul? What's been your experience?
Yeah. Well, my father was a Methodist minister
Ah, okay.
for 10 years of his life, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think, I loved this section that we read, and I love this idea of conscious. I have always thought that conscience was a part of our consciousness, and that we're made aware as children of what our parents think is good and what our parents think is not good. And we want to do what's good because we want to have that approval of
Mm-hmm.
our parents. So it is indoctrinated into us at an early age. But of course, it changes over time. And we get to a point in our development where we have to really use our discernment. And I think that's an ongoing debate, isn't it? Because we find that different people's perception of reality has affected their moral compass.
Mm-hmm.
And so we find that people are doing things that we think uh, maybe would not fall under our moral compass. And we have to ask ourselves how much of this is cultural and how much of this is based on personal experience and how much of it is based on what we know to be good and true. So that's why today's discussion is so relevant and so interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did you have a more unified upbringing in terms of coming to understand what is good and true as a child? Do you think having growing up as a preacher's kid?
I think my mother said what all mothers said: wait till your father gets home. Uh, when we knew when we got in trouble, and I come from an earlier era than you.
Sure.
John Mellencamp wasn't around when I was the age you were referring to.
Uh-huh.
Uh, so back in those days, corporal punishment was not a rare thing. So when we crossed the line, we knew we were going to have to face penalties. So
Mhm.
so if my mother said to either one of us, I'm going to tell your father about this, or wait till your father comes home, we knew that we were in trouble. We knew we had crossed the line.
Mhm.
But I think even before that point, we're all aware of this innate sense. This is a good thing to do. This is a bad thing to do.
Mhm.
This is the right thing to do. This is the wrong thing to do.
Mhm.
And I think I love Lee Wolfenden. I'm partial to Lee Wolfenden's interpretation of New Jerusalem. And I love that his word of what Swedenborg calls perception, Wolfenden calls it intuition.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think that sense, the intuitive sense that something is either right or wrong within us. I think the assumption that I make, which is dangerous, is that everybody has that intuitive sense.
Mhm.
But and they may, but it's different for different people.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think as far back as I can remember, I sensed when something was right or something was wrong. And there were also degrees of right and wrong, which I know this gets kind of hazy, maybe into a gray area. But when I was really, really young, I'm talking about maybe 8 or 9, and my younger sister was maybe 4, 3 or 4. Her every time Christmas came around, my younger sister Diana would come into our rooms, into our bed. I shared a room with my brother. She would come into our room while we weren't there. And this was really famous. We still tease her about this to this day. She stole one of my shoes. She wrapped it up and put it under the Christmas tree for Christmas. Now, she was too young to know, that this was wrong, that stealing was wrong. But and we all joke with her about it, hey, I wonder if I'm going to get, my left shoe or something for Christmas. And it was just her desire to be part of the giving and receiving. And of course, at whatever age she was, 3 or 4, she couldn't go out and buy something. So, but we all joke with her about how being a little thief was her way of being a Santa. And I think it's relevant only in this discussion because did she know at that age that she was doing something wrong by going in and taking something of ours? And I'm like, no, no. And if she did, it was a degree. It was such a small degree of, well, he won't miss this kind of thing. Um, so I think to varying degrees, we all have a sense of something that being is right or wrong or something that's contrary to our moral compass that is developed over time.
And your sister's intentions were good, though.
She was. She's the sweetest little thief I know.
Well, and that's such an important thing that Swedenborg makes a point of a lot. Where, if we're not aware, then we're not the only choices that are really affecting our deepest part of ourselves are the choices that we make in conscious awareness of the wrong that they are doing. And I think so that maybe that leads to a good question for us to move into. How do you think our conscience evolves or grows over time? Have you had experiences in your life where you have become aware of certain maybe truths that you've held about the right way of being that have then been challenged? It seems like that's a big part of this chapter, is that we can have a conscience that's based on falsity, and that part of the process of regeneration is growing in our conscience so that we have a deeper perception kind of what's true. Have you had experiences of that growth or change?
For me, I think, because I know I've brought up many times that I've been in the 12-step program, and I also do the NVC, the nonviolent communication. And so through those 2 programs, I have learned another way to be and realized that other ways that I was before were not effective and may have created or added to the chaos that was already there, and unwittingly or not, maybe even wittingly, and just thinking that I needed to take charge and I was the one that had all the answers, allegedly. So just through those programs, I've learned in those kinds of ways to be differently and to be better. And so, which I feel like has grown my conscience, because I've realized that what I thought was true was not true. And I can see it much more clearly now when I communicate with people, especially people that tend to press my triggers, or vice versa, like family.
Yeah.
So in those ways, for me, I would say that my conscience has grown, because I know there are better ways to do that, certain things, or in conversation or whatever, people. And then when I choose not to use my tools from NVC or the 12 steps, then my conscience will really bother me. Later, I'll be thinking, oh, I could have done this so differently, and I didn't.
So you experience, and he articulates that so well. I love number 133. So part of how a conscience operates in us is by giving us really a feeling experience, that when we're when we're doing right by what we believe to be true, we feel peaceful, we feel calm. But when we go against it, we feel disturbed and pained, or the pangs of conscience.
Absolutely.
So that's the way it kind of operates within us. Ideally, when everything's smooth. But I would argue, and I guess maybe in my own experience, when I think about how I've, from the days of me judging my parents for listening to John Mellencamp to today, my perception of what is good and true has grown and shifted and changed. And sometimes that growth can be painful. So sometimes I think it's tricky to just discern between the pangs of conscience and just the pain of temptation and of growth. And I mean, I would argue, and I think we kind of laid this out at the beginning with Robbin's upbringing, my upbringing. I think so many people's we're exposed to so much as children now, so much difference, unique, different ways of being. And that's a lot. And it doesn't get simpler. It gets more and more complicated. And so I think this is one of those chapters where I really would love for Swedenborg to be right here so we could talk about it, because it feels like he does have kind of a simple view. Conscience develops by the religious tradition that we have, and then but in my estimation, it's not that simple, that it's much more multifaceted. And
I could be wrong, but I see his time as maybe a little bit simpler. Today we have stuff bombarding us. We have social media, we have movies, we have TV, we have our internet and stuff. And for instance, there've been on the internet, they've been promoting another series of Mean Girls. And I know Mean Girls came out in the 90s. What does that do to somebody's conscience when they're promoting and marketing this being mean and thinking it's funny? And so that's why.
Although actually, if you watch the movie, it actually is a redemptive story. But you're right. The title is scary. The title is frightening.
Right. And so we're bombarded. Our youth are bombarded with this kind of stuff. And the games that they play on the internet, PlayStation, they're killing each other. So I think that in today's world, compared to Swedenborg's world, people are bombarded with so much more evilness, and it's made for amusement. And we're back in Swedenborg's day, they didn't have all that. So that's my perspective. It could be way off target, but maybe his life was a little bit simpler than it is today.
I think it was a lot simpler. I think I've been watching the Anne of Green Gables remake, and just that's past Swedenborg's time. And it's there's one minister and one community and one town. I mean, it's life year. It feels like light years different.
Is that Anne with an E?
Yes, Anne with an E. Yes.
I love that. I love the artist. There's the artist I follow on Instagram that did that, the opening with the gold and stuff.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful story. And, it points back to a simpler time. And our time is not so simple. And I think and yet also our time is kind of the time Swedenborg was pointing towards. He was pointing towards this new era. And I think we're in it. And it's complicated. And I guess this leads to another question. You brought this up already, Paul, about perception. I was in a couple of years ago, I did a talk at Freiburg about the conscience, and specifically in relationship to the story of Noah. So to the Noah story in looking at the Bible as this process of our human development. In my reading of Swedenborg, the Noah story is the first emergence of our conscience. So before Noah, in the earlier days, our will and our understanding are one, and we're kind of this more intuitive being where there's no conflict. But then the way Swedenborg interprets the Noah story is the great flood is sort of the end of that era. And before the Noah story, we remember that the Nephilim, the giants of the earth, walking the earth. And that's sort of that's the problem that can happen when we're unified with our will and our understanding, because we can sort of get really full of ourselves and think we're in charge of everything. And so part of what's necessary in our human evolution has been to distinguish between our will and our understanding. And we had, a chapter on that so many weeks ago. And so the conscience is, and he describes the ark as really that first depiction of our conscience. And in the ark, the compartment below is the will, and it's closed off. And the compartment above does have an opening to the sky, and that's our understanding. And that conscience is the ability to understand one thing and will something else. And that's how we evolve, is by being able to have those differences. And our conscience is that part of us that is living in that tension, recognizing what is true and feeling the effects of what it is to live by that truth or to live apart from that truth. And in this chapter and in other places, Swedenborg talks about how that part of our development is the spiritual church, or that's where most of us are living by this conscience that guards our way. But then he talks about perception, and he talks about perception in relationship to the most ancient people. So those earliest people who didn't have this separation had a more natural perception. I've been sort of digging for it. I wonder, okay, the spiritual church, this distinction is a part of the process, but does it then move back towards perception again? Is that innocence with wisdom that we're sort of moving towards coming to a place where we do have more of an ability to be intuitive and to perceive the truth more directly? Or are we always going to be stuck, or is conscience just what it's going to be like to be human, to be in this tug of war? And I wonder, especially at this time in our history where religious understanding or truth is so diverse and so diffuse, it certainly seems like perception would be the way to go. Like that would be more appropriate at this time, and more nimble and more able to act than holding these sort of strict ideas about what's true and living into them. So anyway, I'm curious what your thoughts are in your own life. I mean, do you feel like you have perception of truth that's kind of deeper or more, or it comes to you kind of through your experience of life that's part of your conscience? Do they work together? What do you guys think?
I feel like I have spurts.
Spurts.
I have real brief moments of clarity or that knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't bring it on my own. I have to pray. Yeah. And I open myself up, and then it happens when it happens. And I'm always surprised. And I usually know that it comes from God at that moment. There have been other times when I didn't realize that until later.
Yeah.
But I've had moments where I was in a quandary or something, mm-hmm. and didn't know what to do, and would pray. And then something would just pop out of my mouth, totally not by me, or just something would happen in this scenario that just was completely out of left field, unexpected, and it was wonderful.
Yeah.
And I was like, that was the God thing right there.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I would like to kind of tie this back to your last question, because you asked how we develop conscience, and you mentioned 133, which I love that too, where you were saying we kind of get upset inside if we do something contrary to our conscience. And I'm thinking that to me, when I read that passage, I was thinking, yes, there is a disturbance in the force. It's that Obi-Wan, mantra. It's that idea that we are really, we sense it and we feel it when we do something contrary to what we perceive to be right. I also want to jump over to 137 for those of you who are following. It's an example of what's not right and true that we see in others that helps us to determine what we feel is right and true. In other words, when we see examples of someone saying that what they think is right and true is something we know is opposite of right and true. And I think that plays into it. It's kind of what I call the magic mirror. It's what I call the magic mirror, which I got from a song by Leon Russell. Magic mirror, can you tell me, please? I see myself in everyone I meet? It's the people that we come into contact with that are absolutely contrary to everything we believe is right and true, that help us develop our own sense of what is right and true. And I was a teacher of elementary students for 21 years. And I can tell you this from experience. Every year I knew this when second graders or third graders would come into a classroom. They have a keen sense of what is fair, right? Their sense of equity and fairness is really, really heightened. So much so that I would say 40 years ago, if a second or third or fourth grader were in a classroom, they would do what was right because the teacher said it was right. They would show the teacher respect because the teacher is the teacher. But in this day and age, it's more like, well, if I show the teacher respect, then the teacher has to show me respect, right? It has to be a equitable scenario. And it's more that way now, I sense, than it was decades ago. So my point being, and this is really 134 for those of you who are following, children have a real keen sense of what is fair, but they may not have developed yet a real keen sense of discernment for what is right and what is true. So their sense of what is fair is what you play to when you're talking to children. You try to get on their level and you talk to them about equity of fairness. So yes, I will show you the respect that I'm expecting from you, the same kind of respect from you. And you'll let me know, I'm certain, if I step on your toes, as I will let you know if you step on mine. But there's a mutual respect there. But again, coming back to your most recent point, yes, we not only develop our conscience, but our perception of what is right and true is developed along with our discernment. And our
simultaneously.
Yeah.
Barb is asking us a difficult question that I think we should grapple with around what makes some people not have a conscience. Swedenborg names that it happens in here, but he doesn't really tell us why. But it does certainly seem like there are some people, and I think some people equate this to like, what is the there's a psychological diagnosis for people who are seen to not have a conscience, who operate completely from the perspective of what do I need to do to get what I want, without any concern or wondering about how our behavior affects other people. And I would articulate that. I would say that's probably the definition of not having, that to have a conscience is to believe that there is a good and a just way to be in relationship to others in the world.
I think there can be a couple different ways. One is mental illness.
Yeah.
I worked with adults with developmental disabilities, and fetal alcohol syndrome does damage to the side of the brain where there's remorse. So there is no remorse. And I worked with an adult woman who would do just crazy. She didn't care who she hurt, and she had absolutely no remorse. It didn't even manage how many ways we could try to punish her for her behavior. It didn't faze her at all because that part of her brain was just not there. It was damaged. I also think that some people are created that way. And I'm speaking of people like Trump, like Charles Manson. We know that these people, and there are other people like them, that had bad childhoods. They were, raised on the streets, or they were abused, or they were neglected, we already know these things. And so I think that some severe childhood traumas, whatever they are, can create people that way as well. I think there's different ways. So I kind of am curious in what ways God or Swedenborg thinks are the worst ways. If you suffer from fetal alcohol syndrome, this person has no choice in what has happened to them. And So I'd like to think that that will be forgiven for them, despite what they do.
Yeah. It does seem like it's the case of someone with no conscience. They're
Right.
not acting against their conscience. They just don't have it.
Right.
So in that way, it seems hard to imagine they can be held to account for that way of behaving.
I
Paul?
guess I have a different perspective on this. It's
Mhm.
only because, and I used to feel very strongly about this, that some people don't have a conscience at all. I
Mhm.
remember when I was in high school, 9th grade or 10th grade, my brother, who was one grade ahead of me in school, he and I had this argument because a friend of ours, someone we both knew, had gotten a girl pregnant and then had told her to go get an abortion. He wasn't going to have anything to do with her from then on.
Mhm.
And I remember being so angry at this person that I was telling my brother that he doesn't have a conscience at all. This guy has no conscience. And I remember my brother saying to me, you really don't know that. You really can't say that because you don't know that that's true.
Mm.
And the last sentence of our reading today
Mhm.
is Swedenborg making a point that the conscience is kind of the channel, the influx for
Mhm.
us of what flows into us from heaven. So I was thinking about that. Now, you will all mock me for this, but I woke up at 6 o'clock this morning thinking about this. And a thought occurred to me, and it was like, yes, this is it. I need to write this down. I literally got out of bed, came out, opened my computer, and I wrote this down. I'll share it with you if I'm able to share the screen. And I went back to bed and I was thinking, I'm really glad that came to me. That's really important. Conscience is like a conduit for what is good and true. And then another thought occurred to me, and I had to get up again and come back in and work on it some more. And I'd like to share that with you if
Sure.
you'll permit me.
Sure.
What I'm going to do right now, if I'm able to,
Yeah.
is I'm going to share the screen, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Go
Okay.
ahead. I'm going to make you the host so you can do it.
Should just be able to. Here we go. Okay. So this is what I wrote at 6 o'clock this morning, and you don't have to agree with it. Let me make it bigger so perhaps our friends online can see. Conscience is the conduit by which the marriage of goodness and truth can enter our souls or consciousness and become our moral and ethical guides. It also serves to provide our souls with a sense of guilt and remorse when we act contrary to those internal guidelines. The size of that conduit depends on our love for mercy and truth and our reverence for justice and humility. That last part I put on there because of my love for Micah 6, verse 8,
Mhm.
But it's also true that to the extent that you're humble, that you can accept, your influx can accept goodness and truth from God. And then I went on to say our sense of what is good and true is heavily influenced by cultural and societal norms. 2 centuries ago, for example, slavery was socially acceptable. It is considered human trafficking today and is a crime in most countries. 25 years ago, LGBTQ rights were unheard of and are generally accepted today and legally protected. So let me stop the share there.
Mhm.
So my point is, while I thought this person didn't have a conscience at all, really, perhaps a more accurate way of saying it is that conduit by which heaven can enter into that soul is so narrow and so small that it's virtually indistinguishable. But to say that it's not there would be to defy what God is capable of doing, even in people like Trump.
Right.
So,
I think that's a good point to imagine it getting smaller and that. And when I think about conscience as that point in us where influx is entering in, where we're riled up, it's where we're growing. It's how we grow. And as we can see, as you pointed out so well in what you wrote, our communal conscience has grown as a species over time, and growth requires tension and discomfort. And maybe it's true that there are, I think it is true that there are some people who just don't experience that discomfort. Like Robbin was pointing out, someone with a certain brain injury or something, doesn't feel that inner conflict. And so maybe there's a way in which they are able to be, shaped in other ways. But this gentleman you're mentioning, from your teenage years, so many situations, there's just so many factors at play. And maybe in his conscience, he was working something out. He was making a choice that wasn't something you could understand. And maybe it's a choice that he later will feel remorse about or won't, who knows? But I often think about people who are struggling or people who are making choices that I don't agree with and trying to justify that or trying to understand that. And I feel like the older I get, the more I feel like there's just so much going on in that person that I do not know, and whether it's childhood trauma or, they may actually be making the best possible choice for themselves, as ugly as it looks like from my perspective.
I feel like I should interject something here because I mentioned Trump, and I don't, at the risk of turning off people who might be tuning in, there was a section in 136 that says, suppose you were able to get a particular job. This is Woofenden's translation, but you knew there was someone else who wanted the job and would be more useful to your country in that job than you would be. If you let the other person have the job for the good of your country, you'd be acting out of conscience, right? But the reverse of that is if you think that you would be a better choice for the country, and therefore what happened if the other person got elected just can't be true. It can't be right because you would be the better choice. And I think, and I'm not making excuses for Trump, because this idea that he won the election when all of the facts and the details and the appellate decisions confirmed that he did not win the election, but still he believes he was the right one for the job. So he's going to continue saying that it was a lie. He won the election fair and square. And there's so many people across the country that abide by that. And I'm just going to say that it's very clear to those of us who feel that he didn't, that's a lie and that he's perpetuating a lie. But for those that believe that he did, there's such a strong conviction that he was right for the country that they want to believe it and convince themselves that it's true. So we're talking about conscience, and we're talking about doesn't the heart know its own bitterness? Shouldn't we embrace and accept those things that don't turn out the way that we want them to as being right and true or providential? So that all comes into play here. And I just wanted to interject that because I really am not trying to offend people when I talk about Trump in that way. Again, the size of the conduit in that man, I have no idea if he's able to influx from heaven or not. All I can say is I have to call it as I see it.
Sure. Well, that's a really what that's making me think of, which I think is interesting about the way that Swedenborg frames our conscience, is so this is where influx comes in, and it is primarily and initially entirely shaped by what we are taught. And I think that's maybe something to like pause and just hold for a minute. I think sometimes I think of, I'm connected to God and I have all this knowing and deep knowing. And I think like that's true. But on this level, the conscience is about what we are taught. And so someone who truly believes, that Trump is the right person for the job or whatever, on some level, they're operating from an understanding that they have received from the world, from certain media outlets, from their families, from their communities. I think there's something in this part of our spiritual life that that we really need to take seriously. And I think it's hard to take it seriously because everything's so overwhelming right now. It's like maybe it'd be a little easier if we were just all members of if we were all living in Avonlea, we could, this is what's true. But I do feel like it's something to just be very aware of, like, what are we what are we being taught is true? And I mean, this keeps me up at night sometimes. What are my children being taught is true? What are we, and then how is God working with that? And I don't think it's in this chapter, but I was going down some rabbit holes around some of the arcana references to conscience, and he makes it very clear that, no matter what religious tradition you're a part of, God uses the truths that you are taught to guide us, and that God bends us, doesn't break us, but bends. So we can be taught pretty heinous things. And that's that's kind of the ground that we start this journey on. And hopefully over time, we're exposed to more good influences. Hopefully over time, the falsities that we might be formed by begin to break down. But I think about this in relationship to humans and people who are caught up in things that I don't agree with. But honestly, and more these days, I think about this in relationship to myself. I'm an American. I've been shaped by certain ideals that now, as I enter midlife, as climate change lurks, as institutions start to break down, I wonder often about the truths that I was formed in. You can be whoever you want, kind of some of these attitudes about consuming, about how we live, that I have also likely, that all of us have likely been shaped with assumptions about the truth that are only assumptions, that 200 years from now, our ancestors will go, oh, that was really off, and to be kind of humble enough to be aware that that our conscience too is imperfect. And yet God is working in it, and influx is coming through it. And I think about that a lot. There was another reference in here to conscience in relationship to the decree in the Old Testament about circumcision, and that circumcision was actually a sign of God's, the flesh, the divine in the flesh, and sort of God's willingness to be in our impurity, kind of in our, and I think that's, I think that can't be underestimated, sort of the way in which we're all imperfect, and all of our assumptions are not 100% divine, and yet we have to act, and we have to live, and we have to do our best.
Yeah, I think Swedenborg ties it back to kindness, or caring, as he puts it. I like Lee's expression of kindness, but he says in 135, when we're kind to other people, we have a conscience about what is true, since it's formed by a belief in the truth.
Yeah.
And I really think that's pervades all cultures and societies. But as I mentioned, I often get into discussions with my brother David about conscience. I also get into discussions with my son Ryan about culture, because we've been discussing this Hamas thing back and forth with the Palestinians and with Israel. And I'm telling you, I'm more of a modernist, I think, when it comes to trying to understand what, and I don't know the Quran. For anyone who's watching who understands the Quran, maybe you can enlighten me, but my perception has always been that the Quran teaches that the infidel is actually the person inside us that rebels against the truth, right? But in Ryan's perspective, no. If you take the Quran at its face value, the infidel is anyone who does not believe in in Islam and in Allah, and the violence is somehow not only authorized by the Quran, but encouraged, and that Muhammad himself created acts of violence, specifically beheadings, and that anyone who is martyred doing such violence ends up being accepted into paradise, their word for heaven. So Ryan and I have been going back and forth. I'm going, no, that cannot be true, because there's, so many Muslims in the world who do not believe in violence. So we kind of go back and forth on this. But my whole point is, to what extent does an extreme jihadist have a conscience if their belief is that the more people that they kill, even if they're other Muslims, because they're just giving them a shortcut to paradise, being martyrs, that the closer they are to heaven? I don't get that. I don't understand it. And I can't believe that in their own hearts that they actually think that they're doing good, that they think they're actually abiding by their conscience by creating such horrific acts of violence against humanity.
I first thought, as a Swedenborgian, was maybe you said face value. Maybe that's the key. I mean, if you look at the Bible, face value is pretty violent too, and approved of, allegedly. But we believe in the deeper levels, and maybe there are deeper levels to the Quran as well, deeper levels of meaning, and it's not what it looks like at face value. I'd like to think that. But it did remind me when Urbana University, before Franklin bought it, and we had the scholar in residence and other things that happened there. There was what was it? An event about the peace quilt or something. There was a peace quilt or something like that, and it had international flavors on the quilts, and it was on display. And then there was a panel, and Bessie was part of the panel, but there was a panel from different faith traditions, including Muslim and the Sufis and some other ones. And the Tituses were there, and they talked about what they mean, what the basic tenets are. And there was one, and it might have been the Quran person, it was a lady that spoke, and she was the only one that didn't talk about love and unity and peace. It was totally opposite. It was like a real just dead silent kind of a lecture when she got on there. It just really fell flat, and it was like, wow, I can't believe she said that here. We're promoting peace and love and unity, and she's saying this stuff. It kind of took me aback. But I get it, Paul, and I'd like to think that maybe they're misinterpreting their own religious text.
Yeah. Well, and you made the point, Robbin, the Bible has plenty of problematic declarations about what God is calling people to do. And the Crusades are a great example of Christians making horrific, violent choices in the name of faith. So it does feel like many different traditions can be misinterpreted in this way. And whether that's, I think sort of sticking to our topic, is their conscience founded on this idea of what is right, a perverted idea of what is right? And my suggestion is yes, that part of what Swedenborg's talking about here is our conscience can be faulty. We can have, but whether or not that means they don't have one, I think they do. It's perverted. It's focused in a false way. And my suspicion is that it's actually quite strong and firm in that, and that's what gives people the motivation and the power to do these horrendous things. Otherwise, how could they walk into those places in those violent ways without really believing in that frame of understanding? And I mean, in my mind, the history of religion on this planet is a history of declarations of love and unity, then kind of getting formed and firmed, and then new prophets kind of constantly coming back and saying, no, we have to break this open and remember each other, and kind of always calling us back to, as you mentioned, kindness, to the simplicity of looking and loving one another. And yet still we are so often so far from that experience of unity, and caught very much in these stories of separation, which we see playing out all over our world in so many many, many ways.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I also think that many people have a distorted sense of reality.
Yeah.
And that's where our love for our reverence for justice has to come in, because we do have to stand up and say, this is not the reality that we know.
Yeah.
This is the reality that we know.
Yeah.
What was it? I love it a few sessions ago when Jim Lawrence said the GUK factor, the GUK factor. What's your GUK factor? And G stands for generosity, and U stands for usefulness, and K stands for kindness. And I keep thinking to myself, when people ask me about that part of our theology where we believe that all religious seeking is good, I go a step further and I say that religions are good as long as they promote God as a God of love, and usefulness as a service to the neighbor is the highest form of usefulness.
Right.
And to me, that's all comes back to that GUK factor, usefulness, kindness, generosity. And if your distorted sense of reality has no room for that, then that's not the reality that we know.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel very personally in my process of my conscience, I feel very aware too of the role of in our early development, we're trying to find how we belong, right? We're trying to find our fit. And a lot of our conscience is about doing the right thing, so our teacher will like us, or so we'll be able to, so our parents will keep us, there's so many ways we're motivated by our need to belong. And I think sometimes that need that takes us throughout our life and can become kind of perverse as we age in kind of always seeking approval, or always seeking and really can become kind of an external motivation versus really wanting to do good. But it's also I think that it's so ingrained, it's like easier on some level. Like there's always new ways to belong, always like new beauty creams to buy, or new ways to kind of make ourselves desirable. But once you get over the hump of that, and I feel like I've sort of gone over the hump of that in the last 5 years of like, yeah, I don't care if my chin hairs grow in, like I don't, I'm fine. I belong on this planet, I don't have to prove myself to anybody anymore. But now there's this deep sense of, but what am I called to do? Like, what about this earth that we're sharing and the destruction? And, it's almost like it's opened me up to this deeper despair often, and confusion about kind of about what to do, about what is my conscience calling me to do. And I think that place is I'm hopeful that God will give me some clarity, and that I will come to make some good choices. And it feels like it's I don't know. I think that turn is what we are all kind of, we're called to move into that more collective universal turns, where it's not just about me and my success, my goodness or my badness. And so much of religion is often about that. Will I be saved? Will I go to heaven? Will I, me. But ultimately, it's, if this world is going to turn in a way that my children will have a future, we need to begin to see ourselves as one of and a part. And I don't know, it feels like a new territory for me that's very tender. And I kind of wonder, I think that's why I'm curious about perception. Do we get thrown out of the bucket of conscience where we have to be constantly wondering, and can we be given this higher perception to know how to act, and how to, what will help our world to turn? What are the is it just teaching more of the right? Because it feels like our conscience is good when we know that what is true, but I feel suspicious of how effective that is. There's a lot of teaching happening, but what brings change? What brings
Be the change.
peace?
I think it comes, I love that you said that, Sage, because I so relate to that. It has a profound impact on me. Um,
Mhm.
I think it comes back to goodness, and it comes back to kindness, and it comes back to love. Um, and it's actually, you said a higher form of conscience. That is in 135 of our reading, the last sentence, uh, this kind of conscience that is of the higher kind, it's basically truth from goodness. So it comes back to kindness, goodness, caring. George Dole once said, if you want to know if you're getting into heaven, ask yourself if you care for someone other than yourself. And I wrote that down when I was in class, and I thought that is a mantra worth saving. But later on, I modified it a little bit. And I said, not if you want to know if you're getting into heaven. I said, if you want to know if heaven is getting inside of you, then ask yourself if you're caring for someone other than yourself. If your self-love is below your caring for other people, your your compassion for other people, the good that love does is what you will to perform in your life for other people. And I think we come by truth through the goodness that we do.
Mhm. Mhm.
I have also wrestled too with these things. What am I here to do, and is it going to be effective enough, or is it going to change the trajectory of our shrinking churches? And why would I feel called to be a pastor when the churches are dying off? What for what purpose? And it is scary and depressing, and I know there is a change going on with the churches. People are thinking outside the box and trying to be a part of the new world, so to speak, or the changing world. And so I guess I'm being called to be part of that somehow. But like you said, Sage, how? What does that mean? We still have a building, barely, and we have very few people in it. And so what does that mean? And that's always the big question. What next? Um, and so it gets depressing, but I don't want to go there. So I think that just trying to connect to God more, and in a personal way, and be open to whatever messages I might receive, and also, like Paul said, just being kind and loving, and being that peace, being that love, being that we want to see in the world more of. And that's the whole thing. If you be that, and just do the best you can. And a 12-step slogan is just do the next right thing. Whatever is right before you, that's what you do. That's what your mission is. Just the next right thing. Not, you don't have to worry about the bigger world out at hand. It'll take care of itself. And when I think about breaking it down and making that simple, it's much less burdening.
Sure.
Just do the next right thing that's right before me to do.
Yeah.
I'll add this little tidbit because I talked about Ryan and I having discussions about Hamas. He found a testimony of a jihadist who converted and has left extreme jihadism and is now preaching a peaceful Quran. And I thought that was really, really significant. We both watched his testimony on video, but he was one that had, broken the law, committed crimes, and did violence and all kinds of things, and then renounced his jihadism, or at least interpreted it now in a new way that does not include violence. And I go back to this passage, I mentioned it earlier in Proverbs 14, the heart knows its own bitterness. And I think this comes back to this idea that we do all have an innate sense of what is right and what is wrong. That's where our moral compass comes from.
We have an innate sense of something. I don't know if disagree, maybe that's a little too strong, but I believe God is good, and I believe that the universe is an incredible place, and I am grateful to be a part of it. So I do believe that there is this goodness, and when we kind of look squarely at the human condition and the amount of suffering that we experience in our own selves and that we blather on about with each other, I think when I consider the conscience as the understanding that we hold and how we are living with it or without it, I think we have some growing to do. I guess maybe that's my final statement. I think the human condition has some work to do, and that our understanding is very, very limited at this point. As much as we feel we have evolved and we do all this stuff, that we've evolved in our ability to manipulate our environment. We've evolved in our ability to relay facts about what we perceive with the stuff around us. But in terms of really growing in our wisdom around how it all fits together and how we, as a one life, collective life, how we communicate and cooperate and recognize our distinguishable oneness, to me, that is the work. And I think for myself, it actually is useful sort of to confess my failings or our collective failings, to just to be humble and to be in versus, wow, look how amazing and how much we're evolving. Like, we have evolved, but part of the evolution is starting to really see the places where we have so much more work to do, and to keep on the path. So yes, we are on the path together. I'm so glad you both joined us today. We're after 1 o'clock, and so I guess those are our final thoughts for today. Next week, we move on to freedom. That'll be maybe hopefully a little bit of breath of fresh air. I have Karen File joining me next week and Reverend Junchul Lee, and it will be a little late. We'll be starting at 12:30 to honor Junchul's schedule next Thursday. So thank you, Paul, and thank you, Robbin, for joining.
Thank you.
And we'll see y'all next time. All right. Bye, everybody.